Tonight, we travel to London in the summer of 1889, where a quiet townhouse on Cleveland Street stands in the fading evening light, its windows giving nothing away. Behind those walls lay a mystery that would reach from the cramped offices of the General Post Office to the gilded drawing rooms of the Aristocracy, a scandal discovered almost by accident, and one whose full truth has never been entirely told. Good evening and welcome. You have found your way to a place of calm. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, we shall always have a tale waiting. Cleveland Street runs through the heart of Fitzrovia, a district that in 1889 sat at the edge of London's West End, close enough to respectability to borrow its airs, yet sufficiently removed to harbour its own quieter rhythms. The street itself was not grand, it was not fashionable, it was simply there, one of those London thoroughfares that existed in the spaces between more notable addresses, a place where terraced townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their brick facades darkened by decades of soot, their front steps worn smooth by countless feet. If you had walked along Cleveland Street on a summer evening in that year, you would have noticed first the quality of the light. July in London brings long, slow dusks, and the sun would have lingered above the rooftops until well past 8 o'clock, casting the street in shades of amber and grey. The gas lamps would not yet have been lit, but you might have seen the lamplighter making his rounds in the distance, his long pole resting against his shoulder, unhurried in his work. The air would have carried the familiar sense of a London summer. Horse dung from the streets, coal smoke drifting from chimneys even in the warmth, and beneath it all, the faint metallic tang that seemed to rise from the city itself. The houses along Cleveland Street were of a type common to this part of London. They had been built in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, 3 or 4 stories tall, with basements below and attic rooms above. Many had been subdivided over the years, their original families long since departed for more fashionable quarters, their rooms now let to lodgers, their ground floors converted to small businesses or professional offices. The neighborhood was respectable, in the sense that respectable meant neither wealthy nor destitute. It was a place where clerks lived, where small tradesmen kept their shops, where widows took in boarders to make ends meet. Number 19 stood among its neighbors without distinction. It was a townhouse like any other, its windows draped, its front door painted a color that might once have been green but had faded to something closer to gray. There was nothing about its exterior to suggest that it was anything other than what it appeared to be. A private residence, perhaps a lodging house, perhaps the home of a small family of modest means. The street was busy enough during the day, with carts and carriages passing along the road, with pedestrians moving between Tottenham Court Road and the quieter streets beyond. But as evening fell, Cleveland Street grew still. The shops closed their shutters. The carts returned to their yards. The residents retreated indoors. It was in these evening hours that number 19 came to life in a different way. The front door remained closed, but there was another entrance at the rear of the property, accessible through a narrow passage that ran between the buildings. Those who knew of this entrance used it with care, arriving after dusk and departing before midnight. They came singly for the most part, and they came on foot, having dismissed their carriages some distance away. They did not linger on the street. They did not speak to one another if they happened to pass. They simply slipped through the passage and into the house, and the night swallowed them whole. The interior of number 19 is not described in detail in the surviving records, but we may imagine it from what we know of similar establishments and from the fragments that emerged during the investigation that followed. The rooms would have been furnished simply but comfortably, with heavy curtains to block the light from the street, with gas lamps turned low to create an atmosphere of privacy and discretion. There would have been a parlor where visitors might wait, a staircase leading to the upper floors, and bedrooms arranged for the purpose that brought men to this address. The house was managed by a man named Charles Hammond, who lived on the premises and who had, over time, cultivated a clientele drawn from a particular stratum of London society. Hammond was not a figure of any public prominence. He appears in the records as a shadowy presence, a man who understood the value of discretion and who had built his business on the principle that certain desires, if they were to be satisfied at all, must be satisfied in secret. The law of the land made no allowances for the acts that took place within his walls. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had extended the reach of the criminal code to encompass all sexual contact between men, whether in public or in private, whether by consent or otherwise. The penalty was imprisonment with or without hard labor for a term of up to 2 years. The social penalty was far greater: ruin, ostracism, the destruction of family and career. Men who sought what Hammond offered did so at considerable risk, and they paid well for the assurance that their visits would remain unknown. The young men who provided the services at number 19 were drawn from a different world entirely. They were working boys, most of them employed by the General Post Office as telegraph messengers. Their job was to carry urgent messages across the city, cycling or walking through the crowded streets, delivering telegrams to homes and businesses, returning to the office for their next assignment. It was steady work, but it was poorly paid. A telegraph boy might earn 11 shillings a week, enough to cover the barest necessities but little more. They were young, most of them in their mid to late teens, and they occupied one of the lowest rungs of the urban economy. They were visible everywhere in London, in their distinctive uniforms, their leather satchels slung across their chests, their faces flushed from exertion. They were also, by virtue of their youth and their poverty, vulnerable in ways that the men who visited Cleveland Street were not. How these boys came to be involved with Hammond's establishment is a question that the investigation would later attempt to answer. The path, it seems, ran through the post office itself. A clerk named Henry Newlove, himself only about 18 years old, had connections to Hammond and served as a kind of intermediary, identifying boys who might be willing to earn extra money and introducing them to the house on Cleveland Street. The arrangement was simple. The boys would visit the house in the evening, they would provide sexual services to the clients who came there, and they would be paid for their trouble. The money was good, far better than their official wages, and for boys who had little and wanted more, the temptation was considerable. This, then, was the world that existed behind the unremarkable facade of number 19 Cleveland Street in the summer of 1889. A world of secrets and transactions, of risk and reward, of men who moved between the bright public spaces of Victorian London and the dim private rooms where the rules were different. It was a world that might have continued indefinitely, hidden from view, protected by the silence of all who participated in it. But secrets, in a city as vast and as interconnected as London, have a way of slipping loose. And the thread that would eventually unravel the careful arrangements at Cleveland Street was not pulled by a policeman or a journalist or a moralist. It was pulled, almost by accident, by a postal constable investigating a petty theft. The summer of 1889 was warm and dry, as London's summers sometimes are. The days stretched long, and the evenings brought a welcome coolness after the heat of the afternoon. In the great sorting rooms of the General Post Office, the work continued as it always did, the endless flow of letters and parcels and telegrams that kept the empire connected. And somewhere in those rooms a small discrepancy was noticed, a few shillings that could not be accounted for, and a routine inquiry was begun. It was the sort of thing that happened all the time, a minor matter, hardly worth remarking upon. But this particular inquiry would lead, by a path no one could have foreseen, to the doors of Cleveland Street, and from there to the highest circles of English society. The house still stands, or rather, a house stands where number 19 once stood, for the street has changed over the years, its buildings altered and rebuilt, its character transformed by the passage of time. But if you were to walk along Cleveland Street today, you might pause for a moment and consider the lives that once unfolded there, the young men who came and went in the darkness, the secrets that were kept and the secrets that were told. This is a story about what was discovered in that house, and about what happened when the discovery could no longer be contained. It is a story about power and vulnerability, about justice and its absence, about the distance between what the law demanded and what the world was willing to enforce. And it begins, as so many stories do, with a question that someone decided to ask. The General Post Office in 1889 was one of the great institutions of the British state. Its headquarters stood on St. Martin's le Grand, a short walk from St. Paul's Cathedral, and from this central hub radiated a network of postal and telegraph services that reached every corner of the kingdom, and through the undersea cables and steamship routes, to the far edges of the empire. The building itself was a monument to Victorian confidence, a classical facade of Portland stone, columns and pediments proclaiming the dignity of public service, a grand entrance hall where the business of communication was conducted with all the solemnity of a cathedral. Inside, the atmosphere was rather different. The sorting rooms were vast and noisy, filled with the clatter of machinery and the voices of thousands of clerks and sorters and messengers, all engaged in the ceaseless labor of moving information from one place to another. The telegraph service was the fastest means of communication available, and it was in constant demand. Businesses used it to transmit orders and prices across the country. Families used it to announce births and deaths, arrivals and departures. The government used it for matters of state. And at the heart of this system were the telegraph boys, the young messengers who carried the actual slips of paper from the telegraph offices to the recipients. They were the final link in the chain, the human connection between the electrical impulse that traveled along the wires and the person who needed to read the message. It was work that required speed and reliability, and the post office recruited boys from working-class families who needed the income and who could be trained to navigate the streets of London with efficiency. The wages, as we have noted, were modest. 11 shillings a week was the standard rate, and from this sum a boy was expected to maintain himself, to pay for his lodging if he did not live with family, to feed and clothe himself, and to save what little he could for the future. It was not a sum that allowed for comfort, let alone luxury. The boys worked long hours, often beginning early in the morning and continuing until evening, with only brief breaks for meals. They were subject to strict discipline, and infractions were punished with fines or dismissal. They occupied a position of considerable vulnerability, too young to have established themselves in a trade, too poor to have any reserves to fall back on, and too numerous to be individually valued by their employers. The class structure of Victorian England was visible in every aspect of daily life, and the post office was no exception. At the top were the senior administrators, men of education and social standing who occupied comfortable offices and drew substantial salary. Below them were the clerks, a vast army of literate young men who handled the paperwork and kept the machinery of communication running. And at the bottom were the messengers, the boys who did the physical labor of delivery, who were seen but not heard, who were expected to be quick and obedient and invisible. The distance between these layers was not merely a matter of income. It was a matter of respect, of opportunity, of the assumptions that shaped how a person was treated and what they might hope to become. For a telegraph boy, the path forward was uncertain. Some might eventually be promoted to clerical positions if they proved themselves capable and if vacancies arose. Others might leave the post office entirely, seeking work in shops or factories, or if they were lucky, apprenticeships in skilled trades. But many would simply remain where they were, growing older in a job designed for the young, eventually displaced by the next generation of boys eager for any employment at all. The economic pressures were real and constant, and they shaped the choices that young men made in ways that are not always easy to understand from the comfort of a later age. It was in this context that the offer of extra money, substantial extra money, for work that could be done in the evening hours after the official duties were complete, must have seemed to some boys like an unexpected gift. The sums involved were significant. A single visit to Cleveland Street might bring in as much as a boy earned in a week of legitimate work. The risks were considerable, certainly, but the risks of poverty were also considerable, and for a young man with no savings and no prospects, the calculation was not as simple as it might appear. We do not know what each boy thought or felt when he made the decision to accept the arrangement. The records preserve only the bare facts, that certain boys went to Cleveland Street, that they were paid for their services, and that they continued to do so until the arrangement was discovered. The discovery, when it came, was almost absurdly mundane. In early July 1889, the Post Office's Internal Security Branch, the Confidential Inquiry Branch, was investigating a series of small thefts. Money had gone missing, not large amounts, but enough to warrant attention. The investigation focused on the telegraph boys, who handled cash payments in the course of their duties and who might, it was thought, have been tempted to skim a few coins here and there. It was routine work, the sort of thing the inquiry branch did all the time, and it proceeded according to established procedures: interviews, searches, the careful comparison of accounts. On the 4th of July, a postal constable named Hanks searched a telegraph boy named Charles Thomas Swinskow. The boy was about 15 years old, and he had been employed by the post office for some time. The search revealed that Swinskow was carrying approximately 18 shillings, a sum considerably greater than his weekly wage. This was suspicious. A boy earning 11 shillings a week should not have 18 shillings in his pocket unless he had been saving for some time or had received money from some other source. Constable Hanks asked Swinskow to explain. What followed was a confession, though not of the theft that Hanks had been investigating. Swinskow admitted that the money had not come from the post office. It had come, he said, from a house on Cleveland Street, where he had been paid to provide sexual services to gentlemen. He named the man who ran the house, Charles Hammond. He named the clerk who had introduced him to the arrangement, Henry Newlove, and he indicated that he was not the only telegraph boy involved. The investigation shifted at once. What had begun as a routine inquiry into petty theft became something far more serious. A matter involving criminal acts under the recently amended law, acts that carried the threat of imprisonment and disgrace. The postal authorities reported the matter to the Metropolitan Police, and within days, the machinery of the state had begun to turn. On the 6th of July, a warrant was obtained, and Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, a man who had made his name investigating the Whiteacre murders the previous autumn, visited the house at 19 Cleveland Street. What Aberline found there, or rather, what he did not find, would shape the course of the investigation. Hammond had been warned. By the time the police arrived, the brothel keeper had fled, taking with him whatever records he might have kept, and whatever knowledge he possessed of the men who had visited his establishment. The house was empty, or nearly so, and the trail that might have led to the clients of Cleveland Street had gone cold before it could properly be followed. The days that followed were filled with interviews and statements, with the slow accumulation of evidence and the even slower process of deciding what to do with it. The telegraph boys were questioned, and their accounts were recorded. They named names, some of them, names that belonged to men of standing, men whose families were known, men who moved in circles far removed from the cramped rooms of the post office and the narrow streets of Fitzrovia. And it was here that the investigation began to encounter obstacles that were never fully explained and that have given rise to speculation ever since. The summer wore on and the case remained in a kind of limbo. Charges were prepared against some of the participants, the procurers and the boys who had been most directly involved. But the question of the clients, the gentlemen who had paid for the services that Cleveland Street provided, remained unresolved. There were discussions at the highest levels of the legal establishment, consultations between the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General, memoranda exchanged, and decisions deferred. The wheels of justice, it seemed, turned at different speeds for different people, and the direction in which they turned depended, at least in part, on who was standing in their path. This was the landscape of the Cleveland Street affair, a world in which the law applied to all but was enforced unevenly, in which the poor were visible and the wealthy were protected, in which the truth was known but could not be spoken aloud. It was a world that the Victorians had built with great care, a world of appearances and proprieties, of public virtue and private vice. And it was a world that in the summer of 1889 was about to be exposed to a light it had never expected to face. Charles Thomas Swinskow was 15 years old in the summer of 1889. He was a telegraph boy, one of thousands who worked for the General Post Office, and before the events of that July, there was nothing in the public record to distinguish him from any other young man in his position. He earned 11 shillings a week. He delivered messages across the streets of London. He lived, presumably, with his family or in lodgings, though the records do not specify. He was, in the eyes of the institution that employed him, a replaceable unit of labor, valued for his legs and his reliability and not much else. We do not know what Swinskow looked like. No photograph survives, no physical description has come down to us. We do not know whether he was tall or short, fair or dark, cheerful or solemn. We know only that he was young, that he was poor, and that he found himself, through circumstances that are only partially documented, drawn into an arrangement that would bring his name into the official record and keep it there for more than a century. The decision to accept money for sexual services at Cleveland Street was not one that Swinskow made in isolation. He was introduced to the arrangement by Henry Newlove, a clerk at the post office who was himself only about 18 years old. Newlove occupied a position slightly above the telegraph boys in the hierarchy of the institution, a clerical post that offered marginally better pay and marginally better prospects. How Newlove came to know Charles Hammond, and how he came to serve as an intermediary between Hammond and the boys, is not entirely clear from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that Newlove identified boys who might be willing to participate, made the introductions, and received some compensation for his role. The relationship between Newlove and Swinskow, and between Newlove and the other boys he recruited, was one of unequal power. Newlove was older, he held a superior position, and he possessed knowledge that the boys did not. He knew what was expected at Cleveland Street, he knew the risks involved, and he knew the rewards. The boys who followed his lead were, in a sense, trusting him to guide them through a world they did not fully understand. Whether that trust was justified, whether Newlove acted with any concern for the welfare of the boys he recruited, is a question the records do not answer. Charles Hammond, the man who ran the establishment at 19 Cleveland Street, is an even more elusive figure. He appears in the records as the organizer and manager of the brothel, the person who arranged for clients to visit, who ensured that the house was staffed, and who collected the payments that kept the enterprise running. He was not a man of any social standing. He had no connections to the aristocracy, no claims to respectability. He was simply a businessman of a particular kind, one who had identified a market and found a way to serve it. When the investigation began, he fled the country, and he never returned to face the charges that might have been brought against him. He died abroad, and his story ends in obscurity. The boys themselves, Swinskow and the others whose names appear in the investigation, occupy a peculiar position in the historical record. They were participants in acts that the law defined as criminal, and yet they were also in many ways victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were young, they were poor, and they were offered money that they could not easily refuse. The men who paid for their services were older, wealthier, and far more powerful. The law made no distinction between the client and the provider, treating both as equally culpable, but the social reality was rather different. The boys faced exposure, prosecution, and ruin. The clients, for the most part, did not. Among the names that surfaced during the investigation was that of Lord Arthur Somerset, a man of considerable standing in Victorian society. Somerset was an equerry to the Prince of Wales, a position of trust and honour that placed him within the inner circle of the royal household. He was a member of one of the great aristocratic families of England, connected by birth and marriage to the highest levels of the social order. And he was, according to the statements of the telegraph boys and the observations of the police, a regular visitor to Cleveland Street. Somerset's involvement in the affair was never tested. When the investigation began to focus on him, he left England for France, and he remained abroad for the rest of his life. A warrant was eventually issued for his arrest, but it was never executed. He died in exile, and the question of his guilt or innocence was never formally resolved. The evidence against him was substantial, but it was never subjected to the scrutiny of a trial, and so it remains, like so much else in this case, a matter of inference and probability rather than established fact. The Earl of Euston, another aristocrat whose name was linked to Cleveland Street, took a different approach. When a journalist named Ernest Park published allegations about his involvement, Euston sued for libel. The trial that followed was a spectacle of its own, a contest between the power of the press and the power of the peerage, with the telegraph boys called as witnesses and the details of their activities laid bare for the public to read. Euston's defense was that he had visited Cleveland Street only once, that he had been misled by a card advertising poses plastiques, a euphemism for displays of nude women, and that he had left immediately upon discovering the true nature of the establishment. The jury believed him, or at least believed him enough to convict Park of libel. The journalist was sentenced to a year in prison, and the Earl of Euston's reputation was, officially at least, restored. The telegraph boys who testified at the trial and at the other proceedings that followed were subjected to intense scrutiny. Their statements were taken, their movements were tracked, their credibility was questioned. They were asked to describe in detail the acts they had performed and the men they had performed them with. They were young, they were frightened, and they were caught in a system that had little interest in their welfare and much interest in protecting the reputations of those who mattered. Some of them were prosecuted. Some of them were sent to prison. All of them were marked in one way or another by what had happened. If a descendant of Charles Swinskow were to hear this account, what would they feel? Pride perhaps that their ancestor's name has not been entirely forgotten, that his story has been preserved in some form. Sadness, certainly, at the circumstances that brought him to Cleveland Street, and at the consequences that followed. And perhaps a measure of anger, too, at the inequity of a system that punished the vulnerable and protected the powerful, that demanded conformity to a moral code while making exceptions for those who could afford to pay. The Cleveland Street scandal was not, in the end, a story with a clear resolution. The brothel was closed, the boys were scattered, the clients went on with their lives. The questions that it raised about justice and class and the enforcement of the law were not answered in 1889, and they have not been fully answered since. But the names remain, preserved in the archives and the court records and the newspaper accounts, a reminder that history is made not only by the great and the powerful, but also by the young and the forgotten, by boys like Charles Swinskow who found themselves caught up in events they could neither control nor escape. The morning began before the city was fully awake. In the summer of 1889, London stirred earliest in its poorest quarters, where the business of survival did not wait for the sun to climb above the rooftops. For a telegraph boy employed by the General Post Office, the day started with the walk to work, through streets that were already filling with the sounds of commerce and labor. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the rattle of cart wheels, the voices of vendors setting out their wares. These were the sounds that marked the boundary between rest and duty, between the quiet of a rented room and the ceaseless motion of the city. Charles Swinskow was 15 years old. He earned approximately 11 shillings each week, a sum that placed him firmly among the working poor. His wages were enough to pay for lodging and food, but little else. There was no margin for illness, no cushion against misfortune. Each week's pay was spent before the next arrived, a cycle as regular and relentless as the delivery rounds he walked. The General Post Office employed hundreds of boys like him, young men whose labor kept the city's messages moving from sender to recipient, from office to home, from one end of London to the other. The GPO stood as one of the great institutions of Victorian Britain. Its operations touched every corner of the nation, and its telegraph service represented the cutting edge of communication technology. Messages that once took days to deliver by coach or rider could now arrive within hours, carried by electric impulse along wires that stretched across the country and beneath the sea. The boys who delivered these messages occupied the lowest rung of the postal hierarchy, but their work was essential. Without them, the system would falter. The urgent summons, the business instruction, the personal plea, all depended on young legs and willing hands. A typical day began with the collection of messages at the central office. The boys gathered in the early morning, waiting for their assignments. Each telegram was folded, sealed, and handed over with an address. The boy would set out on foot or by bicycle, navigating the maze of London streets to reach his destination. Some deliveries took him to grand houses in the West End, where servants answered the door and accepted the message with barely a glance at the messenger. Others led to cramped offices in the city, where clerks snatched the paper and waved him away. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and poorly compensated. But it was work, and in a city where employment was never guaranteed, that counted for something. The routes that Swinskow walked would have taken him through neighborhoods of striking contrast. From the respectable terraces of Fitzrovia to the crowded courts of less fortunate districts, the city displayed its inequalities openly. A boy on his rounds saw wealth and poverty side by side, separated sometimes by no more than a single street. He learned to read the city by its doors and windows, by the quality of its paving stones and the condition of its gutters. He learned, too, which houses tipped and which did not, which servants were kind and which were curt. These small calculations shaped the texture of his days. Cleveland Street lay within easy reach of the General Post Office, a short walk through the busy streets near Tottenham Court Road. The neighborhood was mixed in character. Respectable families lived alongside lodging houses and small businesses. The terraced townhouses that lined the street had been built in an earlier era, their Georgian facades now subdivided and adapted to serve a variety of purposes. Number 19 was, to outward appearances, unremarkable. It stood among its neighbors without obvious distinction, a house like many others in that part of the city. What set it apart was known only to those who had reason to know. The connections that linked a telegraph boy to a house like 19 Cleveland Street were fragile and informal. They depended on introductions, on whispered recommendations, on the quiet exchange of information among those who moved in overlapping circles. Henry Newlove, a clerk at the General Post Office, served as one such link. He was older than the messenger boys, perhaps 18, and occupied a position of slightly greater authority within the postal hierarchy. It was Newlove who made the introductions, who explained what was offered and what was expected, who facilitated the transactions that brought working boys into contact with men of means. The arrangement was simple in its outlines. A boy would visit 19 Cleveland Street and provide sexual services to the clients who gathered there. In return, he would receive payment, sums that far exceeded his official wages. For a boy earning 11 shillings a week, the prospect of additional income was not easily dismissed. The money could mean better lodging, warmer clothes, food that was not the cheapest available. It could mean a small measure of security in a life defined by its absence. The moral and legal dimensions of the transaction were for many secondary to the immediate fact of survival. Charles Hammond managed the house at 19 Cleveland Street. He was the organizer, the arranger, the man who ensured that clients and boys were brought together with discretion. The house operated mainly in the evenings, after dusk had fallen and the gas lamps had been lit. Visitors arrived quietly, many using a rear entrance that allowed them to come and go without being observed from the street. The clientele included men of considerable social standing, individuals whose names and titles would have been recognized in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the corridors of Westminster. For them, the house offered something that could not be obtained openly, a space where desire could be satisfied without public consequence. The daily rhythm of a boy like Swinskow thus contained two distinct movements. There was the official day, spent walking the streets with telegrams in hand, answering to supervisors, following the rules of the post office. And there was the unofficial evening, spent in the back rooms of Cleveland Street, engaged in activities that the law condemned and society refused to acknowledge. The boundary between these two lives was maintained by silence, by the understanding that what happened in one sphere must not intrude upon the other. The boys did not speak of their visits to the house. The clients did not speak of the boys. The arrangement persisted because everyone involved had reason to keep it hidden. The relationships that sustained this economy were not, for the most part, relationships of affection or loyalty. They were relationships of convenience and necessity, shaped by the pressures of class and circumstance. A telegraph boy did not choose his clients, nor did he have the power to refuse them. He was, in the eyes of the law and of society, a participant in criminal activity, but his participation was conditioned by vulnerabilities that his social superiors did not share. If the arrangement were discovered, it was the boy who would face the harshest scrutiny, the boy whose name would be recorded in police files and court documents, the boy whose future would be most thoroughly compromised. The landlords and landladies of London's lodging houses asked few questions of their tenants. A young man who paid his rent on time and caused no disturbance was welcome regardless of how he earned his money. The city's anonymity was, in this respect, a form of protection. A boy could move through its streets without being known, could conduct his business without being observed, could return to his room at night without accounting for his movements. But anonymity was also a form of isolation. There was no one to intervene if things went wrong, no one to advocate on his behalf if he found himself in trouble. The connections that linked him to others, to family, to friends, to neighbors, were often tenuous, easily broken by distance or circumstance. For the boys who visited Cleveland Street, the summer of 1889 passed like any other season. The days were long and warm, the streets dusty and crowded, the work unrelenting. They delivered their messages, collected their wages, and made their way to the house when the opportunity arose. They did not know that their names would soon appear in police reports and newspaper columns, that their private arrangements would become the subject of public debate, that the fragile structure of their lives was about to collapse. They knew only the immediate facts of their existence, the weight of the message bag, the ache in their legs, the coins in their pockets, the door at 19 Cleveland Street that opened to admit them and closed behind them without a sound. The scandal that would later bear the name of Cleveland Street began not with a dramatic revelation, but with a small discrepancy, a sum of money that did not add up. It began with the ordinary machinery of institutional oversight, with the questions that supervisors asked when something seemed amiss. It began, in other words, with the routines of daily life, with the fragile connections that linked one person to another in a city of strangers. The boys who found themselves caught up in its aftermath were not actors in a drama of their own choosing. They were workers, survivors, young men trying to make their way in a world that offered them few options and fewer protections. The house at 19 Cleveland Street was, for them, simply another part of that world, another place where money could be earned and risks could be taken, another thread in the web of necessity that held their lives together. The investigation that would expose the activities at 19 Cleveland Street began with a routine inquiry into theft. In early July 1889, Officials at the General Post Office noticed that money had gone missing from the premises. Suspicion fell upon the messenger boys, whose access to the building and whose modest wages made them plausible culprits. A search was ordered, and on 4 July, Constable Hanks of the GPO's Confidential Inquiry Branch examined the belongings of several employees. Charles Swinskow was among those searched. When Hanks inspected his pockets, he found approximately 18 shillings, a sum noticeably greater than the boy's weekly wage. The discrepancy demanded explanation. Swinskow was questioned, and under pressure, he provided an answer that shifted the entire direction of the inquiry. The money, he said, had not come from theft. It had come from working as a prostitute at a house in Cleveland Street, where he had been introduced by a clerk named Henry Newlove. The admission transformed a minor internal investigation into something far more serious. The GPO reported the matter to the Metropolitan Police, and on 6 July 1889, Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline executed a warrant at 19 Cleveland Street. Aberline was already known to the public as one of the lead investigators in the Whitaker murders of the previous year, a man whose name carried weight in matters of criminal inquiry. His presence at Cleveland Street signaled that the authorities were treating the case with gravity. The house was not empty when the police arrived, but Charles Hammond, its manager, was not among those present. He had received warning of the impending raid and had already made arrangements to leave the country. Within days, he would be beyond the reach of English law, settled in France where extradition was not easily obtained. His departure marked the first of several escapes that would come to define the scandal, the first indication that those with resources and connections might evade the consequences that awaited others. Police surveillance of the house continued over the following days. Officers watched the comings and goings at 19 Cleveland Street, noting the identities of visitors and the times of their arrival. The records they compiled painted a picture of a clientele drawn from the upper reaches of society, men who arrived after dusk and departed before midnight, many using the rear entrance to avoid observation. Among the names that appeared in these reports was that of Lord Arthur Somerset, an equerry to the Prince of Wales, and a figure of considerable social standing. The telegraph boys were interviewed in the days and weeks that followed. Their statements provided the foundation for the case against those who had managed and patronized the house. Charles Swinskow, Charles Thickbroom, and others described the arrangements that had brought them to Cleveland Street, the introductions made by Newlove and others, the payments they had received, the acts they had performed. Their testimony was detailed, specific, and damning. It implicated not only the procurers who had recruited them, but also the clients who had paid for their services. Henry Newlove and a man named Veck were arrested and charged with procuring boys to commit acts of gross indecency, an offence under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885. The act had been passed only 4 years earlier, extending the criminalization of male homosexual conduct and providing the legal framework within which the Cleveland Street case would be prosecuted. The penalties were severe, up to 2 years' imprisonment with or without hard labor. The arrests did not extend, however, to the clients whose names appeared in police reports. Lord Arthur Somerset was interviewed by Inspector Aberline on 7 August 1889, but he was not charged. Instead, he was permitted to leave the country, traveling first to the continent and eventually settling. The decision not to prosecute him, and others of similar standing, would become one of the most controversial aspects of the scandal. Critics alleged that the authorities had deliberately shielded the aristocracy, allowing wealthy and well-connected men to escape, while working-class participants faced the full weight of the law. The silence that followed the initial flurry of arrests was not absolute. Rumors circulated through London, whispered in clubs and coffee houses, hinted at in the pages of newspapers that dared not speak plainly. The North London Press, edited by a journalist named Ernest Park, broke the silence on 28 September 1889 with an article alleging that among the visitors to Cleveland Street had been the heir to a duke and the younger son of a duke. The story did not name names, but its implications were clear. The scandal reached into the highest levels of society, touching families whose reputations were supposed to be beyond reproach. Park's article provoked a response. The Earl of Euston, who believed himself to be the target of the allegations, brought a libel suit against the journalist. The trial that followed became a public spectacle, drawing crowds to the courtroom and filling the newspapers with testimony that laid bare the workings of 19 Cleveland Street. Witnesses described the house, the clients, the boys, the transactions. The Earl of Euston maintained that he had visited the address only once, having been misled by a card advertising tableaux plastiques, and had left immediately upon realizing the true nature of the establishment. The jury believed him. Park was convicted of criminal libel and sentenced to imprisonment. The trials of Newlove and Veck proceeded with less public attention, but with outcomes that confirmed the pattern of unequal justice. Veck received 9 months hard labor. Newlove received 4 months. The sentences were light by the standards of the Act, and they were served by men who occupied the lower rungs of the social ladder. The clients, the men of wealth and title who had paid for the services that Newlove and Veck had procured, remained untouched. The boys themselves occupied an ambiguous position in the proceedings. They were witnesses, their testimony essential to the prosecution's case, but they were also participants, young men who had engaged in acts that the law condemned. Some faced scrutiny and suspicion. Others simply disappeared from the record, their names appearing in police files and court documents, and then vanishing into the anonymity of the city. What became of Charles Swinskow after the scandal faded from public attention is not recorded in the sources that survive. He was 15 years old when his name first appeared in the investigation. He had been a telegraph boy, a worker, a young man trying to earn a living in a city that offered him few choices. The scandal that bore the name of Cleveland Street swept him up, used his testimony, and then moved on. The house at 19 Cleveland Street was closed. Charles Hammond remained abroad, beyond the reach of prosecution. Lord Arthur Somerset never returned to England. The questions that the scandal had raised about justice and class and the enforcement of the law were debated in newspapers and in Parliament, but they were not resolved. The summer of 1889 gave way to autumn, and autumn to winter, and the city continued its ceaseless motion, its streets filled with the sounds of commerce and labor, its gas lamps flickering in the evening gloom. The boys who had walked those streets, who had delivered their messages and made their visits and kept their secrets, were absorbed back into the life of the city, their individual stories submerged beneath the weight of events they could neither control nor escape. The discovery came not through any dramatic revelation, but through the quiet arithmetic of a postal constable doing his duty. In early July of 1889, the General Post Office conducted one of its periodic investigations into internal theft. Money had gone missing, as money sometimes did in large institutions where coins passed through many hands, and the temptation of want pressed upon those whose wages barely covered the cost of living. The Confidential Inquiry Branch, that discreet arm of the postal service charged with maintaining order among its own employees, began its methodical work of questioning and searching. The General Post Office stood as one of the great institutions of Victorian London. From its headquarters near St. Martin's le Grand, it dispatched letters and parcels across the empire, connected the capital to the provinces, and employed thousands of workers in a vast hierarchy of clerks, sorters, carriers, and messengers. Among the lowest ranks of this hierarchy were the telegraph boys, young men and adolescents who earned their wages by carrying urgent messages through the streets of London. They wore their distinctive uniforms, rode bicycles or walked briskly through traffic, and knew the city's geography with the intimacy that comes from traversing it daily. Their work was essential, their pay was modest, and their position in the world was precarious. Charles Thomas Swinskow was one such telegraph boy. He was about 15 years old, employed at the GPO, earning roughly 11 shillings per week for his labor. 11 shillings bought food and lodging of the plainest sort, with little left over for anything beyond the necessities of survival. It was a sum that kept a young man fed but not comfortable, housed but not secure. The arithmetic of poverty was familiar to boys like Swinskow, who understood precisely what their wages could and could not provide. On the 4th of July, 1889, Postal Constable Hanks conducted a routine search of Swinskow as part of the theft investigation. What he found was not stolen property in the conventional sense, but something that raised its own questions. The boy was carrying approximately 18 shillings in his pocket. This was significantly more than his weekly wage, more than a telegraph boy could reasonably be expected to possess on an ordinary working day. The discrepancy demanded explanation. Constable Hanks was not a man given to dramatic confrontation. His work required patience and attention to detail, the steady accumulation of facts rather than the pursuit of confessions. He questioned Swinskow about the money. Where had it come from? How had a boy earning 11 shillings per week come to carry 18 shillings on his person? The answer Swinskow provided shifted the entire nature of the inquiry. He admitted that the money had not come from theft at the post office. It had come from another source entirely. He had earned it, he said, by working as a prostitute for a man named Charles Hammond, at an address in Cleveland Street. The words hung in the air of that institutional space, transforming what had been a simple investigation into internal dishonesty into something far more complex and troubling. The postal constable had been looking for a petty thief. He had found instead a thread that, when pulled, would unravel into one of the most significant scandals of the late Victorian. Cleveland Street lay in Fitzrovia, that district of central London situated near Tottenham Court Road, within easy reach of the West End's theatres and shops, and the quieter residential streets that spread northward toward Regent's Park. It was a neighborhood of terraced townhouses, many of them subdivided into lodgings and small establishments, where respectability and its opposite existed in close proximity. The street itself was unremarkable, one of many such thoroughfares in that part of the city, lined with buildings that had seen better days and would see worse ones still. Number 19 Cleveland Street was a townhouse of conventional appearance. Nothing in its exterior distinguished it from its neighbors. There was no sign, no indication visible from the street of what took place within its walls. The house operated, as such places did, through discretion and reputation, through cards passed quietly from hand to hand and introductions made in circumstances that left no official record. Those who knew of its existence knew how to find it. Those who did not were not meant to learn. The house was operated by Charles Hammond, who arranged for young men to meet with clients seeking intimate encounters. The telegraph boys who visited Cleveland Street did so not as part of their official duties, but as participants in an informal economy that supplemented their meager wages. They were paid for sexual services, and the money they received exceeded what the post office could offer them. For boys living on the margins of subsistence, the calculation was not difficult to understand, even if the risks were considerable. Once Swinskow's admission reached the appropriate authorities within the GPO, the matter could no longer be contained as an internal affair. The Postal Service notified the Metropolitan Police, and within days the investigation had passed into the hands of Scotland Yard. A warrant was prepared, and on the 6th of July, 1889, Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline visited 19 Cleveland Street. Aberline was an experienced officer, known for his methodical approach and his familiarity with the darker corners of London life. He had worked cases that tested the limits of what polite society wished to acknowledge, and he approached this new assignment with the same careful attention he brought to all his work. The warrant authorized him to enter the premises and make inquiry. What he found there, and what he learned in the days that followed, would set in motion a chain of events that reached far beyond a single townhouse in Fitzrovia. The police conducted surveillance of the property over the following days. On the 9th of July and again on the 13th, officers watched the comings and goings at Cleveland Street. They noted the times at which visitors arrived, typically between dusk and midnight, when the gas lamps cast their yellow light across the pavement, and the streets grew quieter as respectable citizens retired to their homes. They observed that many visitors entered not through the front door, but through a rear entrance, a detail that spoke to the desire for discretion among those who frequented the establishment. The visitors themselves were of particular interest. Police surveillance recorded men of apparent higher social status arriving at the house, their dress and bearing marking them as gentlemen rather than working men. The rear entrance allowed them to approach with some degree of concealment, avoiding the more public aspect of the front door. It was a small architectural detail, but it revealed much about the nature of the establishment and the anxieties of its clientele. Meanwhile, the questioning of telegraph boys continued. Swinskow was not the only one who had visited Cleveland Street. Other names emerged, other boys who had supplemented their wages in the same manner. Charles Thickbroom was among them, and there were others still. A network began to take shape in the investigators' notes, connecting the General Post Office to the townhouse in Fitzrovia, linking working-class youths to a clientele drawn from very different circumstances. The intermediaries who had facilitated these connections also came under scrutiny. Henry Newlove, a GPO clerk aged about 18, was identified as someone who had introduced telegraph boys to Charles Hammond. James Veck was another figure involved in the recruitment and arrangement of encounters. These men occupied a middle position in the hierarchy of the establishment, neither the wealthy clients who paid for services nor the boys who provided them, but the connectors who made the transactions possible. As July gave way to August, the investigation expanded. Police interviewed more witnesses, gathered more statements, and compiled reports that would eventually reach the highest levels of government. The names that appeared in those reports included not only telegraph boys and procurers, but also men of considerable social standing. Lord Arthur Somerset, an equerry to the Prince of Wales, was identified by some witnesses as a client of the Cleveland Street establishment. The implications of such an identification were profound, touching as they did upon the royal household itself. The discovery at the General Post Office had begun with a simple question about money in a boy's pocket. It had led, within a matter of weeks, to an investigation that threatened to expose the intimate lives of some of the most prominent men in England. The quiet arithmetic of Constable Hanks had set in motion forces that would prove difficult to control and impossible to ignore. To understand how the Cleveland Street establishment functioned, one must first understand the spatial logic of late Victorian London, a city of distinct neighborhoods and carefully maintained boundaries, where geography shaped the possibilities of daily life. Cleveland Street occupied a particular position within this urban landscape. It lay in Fitzrovia, close to Tottenham Court Road, which served as one of the major commercial arteries of the West End. The area combined residential streets with small businesses, lodging houses with respectable homes, creating a mixed environment where different classes and occupations existed in proximity. This was not Mayfair, with its grand townhouses and aristocratic residents, nor was it the East End, with its poverty and overcrowding. Fitzrovia occupied a middle ground, respectable enough to avoid constant police attention, anonymous enough to permit activities that required discretion. The townhouse at number 19 was typical of its street, a terraced building of the sort constructed in the late 18th or early 19th century, and subsequently adapted to changing uses. Such houses were often subdivided, their rooms let to lodgers or converted to commercial purposes. The exterior gave no indication of what occurred. A visitor approaching from the street would see only another London townhouse, its windows curtained, its door closed against the noise and dust of the thoroughfare. The rear entrance proved crucial to the establishment's operation. Police surveillance noted that many visitors arrived not at the front door, where they might be observed by neighbors or passers-by, but through a back way that offered greater concealment. This architectural feature, common enough in London townhouses of the period, took on particular significance in the context of Cleveland Street. It allowed men of standing to enter and depart with reduced risk of recognition, preserving the appearance of respectability even as they engaged in acts that the law condemned. The routes by which clients reached Cleveland Street varied according to their circumstances. A gentleman might arrive by hansom cab, directing the driver to a nearby street and walking the final distance on foot. A working man might approach directly, having less reputation to protect and fewer resources with which to protect it. The telegraph boys who provided services at the house came from the General Post Office, their journeys through the city streets indistinguishable from the ordinary rounds of their employment. They knew London's geography intimately, having traversed it daily in the course of their work, and they could reach Cleveland Street without attracting notice. The timing of visits followed a predictable pattern. Police observers noted that clients typically arrived between dusk and midnight, during the hours when gas lamps illuminated the streets and the city's respectable inhabitants had withdrawn to their homes. Evening provided cover that daylight could not offer, the darkness softening the edges of recognition and allowing men to move through the city with greater anonymity. The house itself would have been lit by gas, its interior warm and enclosed, separated from the chill of the street outside. The evidence gathered by investigators took forms characteristic of the period. There were no fingerprints to analyze, no forensic techniques of the sort that later generations would develop. Instead, the case rested upon testimony, upon the statements of witnesses who described what they had seen and done. The telegraph boys provided accounts of their visits to Cleveland Street, naming the man who had introduced them to the establishment, describing the nature of the services they had provided, and identifying some of the clients they had encountered. These statements were taken down in writing, preserved in official reports, and would eventually form the basis for legal proceedings. Police surveillance contributed additional evidence. Officers watching the house recorded the arrival and departure of visitors, noting times and, where possible, descriptions. They observed the pattern of activity that marked Cleveland Street as something other than an ordinary residence. The comings and goings at unusual hours, the use of the rear entrance, the apparent social standing of certain visitors, all these details accumulated in the investigators' notebooks, building a picture of the establishment's operations. Documentary evidence also played a role. References in later accounts mention a logbook or related records of visitors, though the precise nature and fate of such documents remains unclear. Cards bearing the Cleveland Street address, circulated among those who knew of the establishment, passed from hand to hand as introductions to its services. These physical objects, ephemeral as they were, served as the connective tissue of a network that linked working-class boys to wealthy clients, the General Post Office to a townhouse in Fitzrovia. The investigation raised questions that the evidence could not definitively answer. How extensive was the clientele of Cleveland Street? How many men of standing had visited the establishment, and over what period of time? The statements of telegraph boys provided some names, but witnesses could only identify those they had personally encountered. The full scope of the operation remained obscured, visible only in fragments and glimpses. Two competing interpretations emerged from the evidence, and they have persisted in historical discussions of the case to the present day. The first interpretation emphasized the breadth of aristocratic involvement, and suggested that authorities deliberately curtailed the investigation to protect men of high standing. According to this view, the names that appeared in police reports represented only a fraction of those who had frequented Cleveland Street. Powerful interests intervened to limit prosecutions, allowing wealthy clients to escape the consequences that fell upon working-class participants. The flight of Lord Arthur Somerset to France, where he remained beyond the reach of English courts, exemplified this pattern of protected escape. The relatively light sentences imposed upon the procurers, Vec receiving 9 months and Newlove 4, reflected a judicial reluctance to pursue the matter too vigorously. The rumors that swirled around even more elevated figures, including suggestions that touched upon the royal family itself, indicated the true extent of what was being concealed. The second interpretation took a more cautious view of the evidence. It acknowledged the class disparities in how the case was handled, but questioned whether a coordinated conspiracy of concealment could be proven from the available records. Prosecutorial decisions reflected the practical difficulties of building cases against men who had resources to defend themselves and who could simply leave the country if charges seemed imminent. The law required evidence, and evidence was difficult to obtain when witnesses were reluctant and documentary proof was scarce. The rumors about Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, had never been substantiated and rested upon speculation rather than confirmed testimony. Historians who examined the case closely found gaps in the documentary record, missing police interviews and incomplete files, but gaps did not necessarily prove a cover-up. They might simply reflect the ordinary losses and omissions that affected all historical records. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lay somewhere between these positions, shaped by factors that no single interpretation could fully capture. What the evidence did reveal with reasonable clarity was the operation of an establishment that brought together individuals from very different social circumstances. Charles Hammond managed the house, arranging encounters and collecting. Henry Newlove and James Vec recruited telegraph boys, identifying young men whose financial circumstances made them receptive to offers of additional income. The boys themselves, Swinskow and Thickbroom and others, provided sexual services in exchange for money that exceeded their official wages. And the clients, men of varying social positions, but including at least some of considerable standing, paid for access to these services in a setting designed to preserve their anonymity. The spatial arrangement of this network reflected the broader geography of Victorian London. The General Post Office, that great institution of communication and commerce, employed thousands of workers in conditions of modest pay and limited prospects. Cleveland Street, situated in a neighborhood that combined respectability with anonymity, provided a venue where transactions could occur away from public view. The clients came from elsewhere, from the wealthier districts of the West End, or from addresses that the records did not preserve, traveling through the city's streets to reach a destination that existed precisely because it could not be easily found. The rear entrance, the evening hours, the cards passed quietly from hand to hand. All these details spoke to the architecture of discretion that made such establishments possible. Victorian London was a city of surfaces and depths, of public propriety and private transgression, and Cleveland Street occupied the space between these realms. It was visible to those who knew how to look for it and invisible to those who did not. The forensic evidence of the case, such as it was, consisted primarily of human testimony. The telegraph boys described what they had done and with whom. The police recorded what they had observed. The prosecutors assembled these fragments into cases that could be brought before the courts. But testimony was fallible, shaped by fear and self-interest, by the pressures of interrogation and the uncertainties of memory. The boys who provided statements were themselves vulnerable, subject to prosecution for their participation and dependent upon the goodwill of authorities who could choose to treat them as witnesses or as defendants. Their words carried weight, but they also carried the marks of the circumstances under which they were given. The competing theories about Cleveland Street, about the extent of aristocratic involvement and the degree of official protection, cannot be resolved with certainty on the basis of surviving evidence. Cozy crime does not solve mysteries, it contemplates them. What can be said is that the case exposed tensions within Victorian society that the law and custom sought to conceal. It revealed the vulnerability of working-class youths to exploitation and the relative immunity of wealthy men to consequences. It demonstrated how geography and architecture could be arranged to facilitate activities that public morality condemned. And it left behind questions that historians continue to debate, questions about justice and class, and the limits of what the records can tell us. The townhouse at 19 Cleveland Street still exists as an address in central London, though the building has been altered over the intervening years. The street itself remains, a thoroughfare in Fitzrovia that bears no visible trace of the scandal that once made its name notorious. The General Post Office has moved and changed, its Victorian headquarters long since adapted to other uses. The routes that telegraph boys once travelled, carrying messages through streets filled with horse-drawn traffic and the noise of commerce, have been transformed by a century of urban development. But the questions that the Cleveland Street scandal raised have not disappeared. They persist in the gaps of the historical record, in the names that were never confirmed and the testimonies that were never given. They linger in the space between what was known and what was suspected, between what could be proven and what could only be whispered. The summer of 1889 gave way to autumn, and the investigation continued, and the city went on with its business, and somewhere in the archives the evidence remains, partial and fragmentary, waiting for those who wish to contemplate what it might mean. The investigation that unfolded in the summer of 1889 brought together several branches of authority, each with its own methods and limitations. What began as an internal inquiry at the General Post Office soon passed into the hands of Scotland Yard, and from there into the corridors of legal counsel and political discretion. The detectives who pursued the case were experienced men, accustomed to the complexities of London crime. Yet the Cleveland Street affair would test the boundaries of what an investigation could achieve when the suspects included not only working men, but members of the aristocracy. The first figure to take notice of something amiss was a postal constable named Hanks, employed in the confidential inquiry branch of the General Post Office. His duties involved the quiet work of internal security, watching for theft, dishonesty, and irregularities among the thousands of employees who kept the postal system running. In early July 1889, Hanks was conducting a routine investigation into missing money. The sums were not large, but the post office took such matters seriously. A culture of trust was essential to the institution's functioning, and even small thefts could undermine it. During the course of this inquiry, Hanks searched a telegraph messenger named Charles Thomas Swinskow. The boy was about 15 years old, one of many youths employed to carry telegrams and urgent messages through the streets of London. His official wage was approximately 11 shillings per week, a modest sum that reflected his low position in the hierarchy of post office labor. When Hanks examined the contents of Swinskow's pockets, he found 18 shillings, a figure noticeably higher than the boy's weekly earnings. The discrepancy was enough to warrant further questioning. Under pressure, Swinskow offered an explanation that shifted the investigation onto entirely different ground. He admitted that the extra money had not come from theft, but from another source altogether. He had been paid, he said, for visiting a house at 19 Cleveland Street, where he had engaged in sexual acts with men. The money was compensation for these services, arranged through intermediaries who recruited telegraph boys for the establishment. This confession transformed a minor internal matter into something far more serious. The activities Swinskow described were criminal offences under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885, which had extended the law to cover all homosexual acts between men, punishable by up to 2 years imprisonment, with or without hard labor. The post office could not simply dismiss the matter as a personnel issue. It required the attention of the Metropolitan Police. The case was referred to Scotland Yard, and the officer assigned to lead the investigation was Detective Inspector Frederick Abberline. His name would later become associated with other notable cases of the period, but in the summer of 1889 his task was to determine the nature and extent of the operation at Cleveland Street. On 6 July, Abberline executed a warrant and visited the premises at number 19. What he found confirmed the substance of Swinskow's account. The house was being used as a male brothel, a place where young men, many of them telegraph boys, were brought to meet clients who paid for sexual encounters. Abberline's methods were thorough but constrained by the circumstances. He conducted formal interviews with several of the telegraph boys, gathering their statements about how they had come to visit the house, who had recruited them, and what had occurred there. He also interviewed intermediaries, men who had served as go-betweens, arranging introductions and managing the flow of young workers to the establishment. Among those questioned were Henry Newlove, a clerk at the post office aged about 18, and a man named James Veck, sometimes recorded as John Veck, who had played a role in procuring boys for the brothel. In addition to interviews, the police conducted surveillance of 19 Cleveland Street over a series of days. Officers watched the comings and goings at the house, noting the times at which visitors arrived and departed. The pattern that emerged was consistent with the boys' statements. Men of apparent higher social status were observed entering the property, often between dusk and midnight, and many of them used a rear entrance that allowed for greater discretion. The use of this back door suggested an awareness among the clientele that their visits were not to be seen from the street. The surveillance logs and interview records formed the documentary basis for the investigation. Yet even as Abberline and his colleagues gathered evidence, they encountered obstacles that would shape the course of the case. The names that began to surface in witness statements included not only working men and minor clerks, but individuals of considerable social standing. Among those identified was Lord Arthur Somerset, an equerry to the Prince of Wales and a figure with connections to the highest levels of society. The involvement of such names introduced complications that went beyond ordinary police work. Reports were prepared for the Attorney General, the Solicitor General, and the Director of Public Prosecutions, outlining the evidence and seeking guidance on how to proceed. The question of whether to charge aristocratic suspects became a matter of legal and political deliberation, conducted at levels far above the detective branch. The suspects themselves occupied very different positions in the social order. Charles Hammond was the man who operated the brothel at 19 Cleveland Street. He managed the premises, arranged for telegraph boys to meet clients, and profited from the transactions that took place within. His role was that of a businessman in an illicit trade, providing a service to men who sought discretion and were willing to pay for it. When the investigation began to close in, Hammond left the country, departing for France before he could be arrested. His flight removed the central figure of the operation from the reach of English courts. Henry Newlove occupied a middle position, a young clerk who had used his employment at the post office to identify and recruit boys for the brothel. He was not the proprietor, but he was more than a passive participant. His actions in procuring youths for Hammond's establishment made him liable under the law, and he was among those committed for trial. James Veck was similarly implicated in the recruitment of boys. His precise role is less fully documented than Newlove's, but he appeared in the legal proceedings as a procurer, a man who had facilitated the movement of young workers into the orbit of 19 Cleveland Street. The telegraph boys themselves, including Swinskow and another youth named Charles Thickbroom, occupied the lowest rung of this hierarchy. They were working-class employees, earning modest wages, and supplementing their income through activities that exposed them to legal jeopardy. Their statements provided much of the evidence that sustained the investigation, yet their position was precarious. They were participants in criminal acts, and their willingness to testify was shaped by the pressure of interrogation and the hope of leniency. Lord Arthur Somerset presented a different kind of challenge. As an equerry to the Prince of Wales, he moved in circles that commanded deference and discretion. His name appeared in the statements of witnesses, and police enquiries sought to establish the nature and frequency of his visits to Cleveland Street. On 7 August 1889, Inspector Abberline conducted an interview with Somerset, the details of which have not fully survived in the documentary record. What is known is that Somerset was not immediately arrested. Instead, he was permitted to leave the country, traveling to France, where he remained beyond the jurisdiction of English law. The Earl of Euston, also known as Lord Euston, became entangled in the scandal through a different route. His name was published in connection with the brothel, and he responded by bringing a libel suit against the journalist who had made the allegation. In the course of that suit, evidence was presented regarding his visit to 19 Cleveland Street. Lord Euston's defense rested on the claim that he had been misled. He stated that he had received a card advertising what he understood to be an exhibition of nude women, described by the French term tableaux plastiques. Upon arriving and discovering the true nature of the establishment, he said he had left immediately. The jury in the libel case accepted his account, and the journalist was convicted. The institutional context of the investigation shaped its limits. The police could gather evidence, conduct interviews, and prepare reports, but the decision to prosecute rested with legal officials who weighed considerations beyond the strength of the case. The presence of aristocratic names among the suspects introduced questions of public interest, political sensitivity, and the potential consequences of a trial that might expose the private lives of men connected to the royal household. Some historians have argued that the investigation was deliberately curtailed to protect the powerful. Others have pointed to the absence of conclusive documentary proof of a coordinated effort to suppress the case, suggesting instead that the cautious decisions of prosecutors reflected the ordinary difficulties of building cases against well-connected defendants. The truth may lie somewhere between these interpretations, in the gray area where legal judgment, social pressure, and institutional caution intersected. What is certain is that the investigation produced uneven results. Lower-status participants faced prosecution and imprisonment. Newlove received a sentence of 4 months, Vec 9 months with hard labor. These penalties, while below the statutory maximum, marked the men as criminals and ended their prospects of respectable employment. Hammond, by contrast, escaped to the continent and never stood trial in England. Lord Arthur Somerset lived out his years abroad, his reputation damaged but his liberty intact. The detectives who worked the case did so within the constraints of their time. Abberline and his colleagues followed the evidence where it led, but they could not compel the prosecution of suspects whom higher authorities chose not to pursue. The methods of Victorian policing, the surveillance, the interviews, the careful documentation, were sufficient to establish what had occurred at 19 Cleveland Street. They were not sufficient to ensure that all those responsible would answer for it in court. The investigation left behind a partial record, fragments of testimony, surveillance logs, legal opinions, and the proceedings of trials that addressed only some of the participants. In the gaps of that record, questions persist. How many men of high standing visited the house on Cleveland Street? How far did knowledge of their activities extend? And what decisions, made in offices far from the detective branch, determined who would be charged and who would be allowed to slip quietly away? These questions have no definitive answers. The evidence that survives is incomplete, shaped by the choices of those who created it and those who preserved it. What remains is a picture of an investigation that reached certain limits and stopped, leaving the full story of Cleveland Street suspended between what was proven and what was only suspected. The Cleveland Street scandal did not unfold in isolation. It emerged in a particular moment of late Victorian life, when questions of morality, class, and public order occupied the attention of press and public alike. The summer of 1889 was a season of ordinary business and extraordinary tension, and the revelations from a townhouse in Fitzrovia became one thread in a larger fabric of social anxiety and political debate. The press coverage of the scandal reflected the divided character of Victorian journalism. Some newspapers approached the subject with restraint, constrained by laws on obscenity and the conventions of respectable reporting. Others seized upon the story with an energy that bordered on the sensational, recognizing in it the elements that sold copies: aristocratic vice, youthful vulnerability, and the suggestion of a cover-up at the highest level. The North London Press, a small but assertive publication edited by a journalist named Ernest Park, played a central role in bringing the scandal to wider attention. On 28 September 1889, Park published a story alleging that among the visitors to 19 Cleveland Street were the heir to a duke and the younger son of a duke. The phrasing was careful, stopping short of naming individuals directly, but it was enough to suggest that the clientele of the brothel included men of the highest social rank. The article accused the authorities of protecting these men while prosecuting their social inferiors, a charge that resonated with readers who already harbored suspicions about the unequal application of the law. Other newspapers followed, each calibrating its coverage to the expectations of its readership. Reynolds's News, a publication with radical sympathies, ran headlines that spoke of a corrupt aristocracy and demanded accountability for those who had escaped prosecution. The tone was one of moral outrage, directed less at the acts themselves than at the perceived hypocrisy of a ruling class that punished working men for offenses it tolerated among its own. International papers also took notice. The New York World published accounts under headlines such as "London's Vile Scandal," introducing American readers to a story that combined the familiar themes of British class privilege with the more lurid details of sexual misconduct. The transatlantic coverage amplified the sense that the scandal had implications beyond the borders of England, reflecting on the character of British society as a whole. The public reaction was shaped by the particular anxieties of the moment. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had been passed only 4 years earlier, extending the criminalization of male homosexual acts and signaling a tightening of legal and moral controls. The law reflected a broader concern with public morality, a desire to regulate behavior that was seen as threatening to the social order. The Cleveland Street scandal tested the limits of that regulatory impulse, exposing the difficulty of enforcing moral standards when the offenders included men with the resources and connections to evade prosecution. Class resentment ran through much of the commentary. The telegraph boys who had visited 19 Cleveland Street were working-class youths, employed at low wages and vulnerable to the pressures of economic necessity. Their participation in the brothel's activities was understood, at least by some observers, as a consequence of poverty rather than moral failing. The aristocratic clients, by contrast, were men of wealth and privilege, whose involvement suggested not desperation but indulgence. The disparity between the treatment of these two groups became a focal point for criticism, with commentators questioning why the law fell heavily on the poor while the rich went free. The scandal also intersected with broader debates about the press and its role in public life. Park's decision to publish allegations against unnamed aristocrats brought him into conflict with the libel laws, and his subsequent prosecution and conviction demonstrated the risks faced by journalists who challenged the powerful. The case raised questions about the boundaries of legitimate reporting, the protection of reputation, and the extent to which the press could serve as a check on official discretion. Rumors circulated that went beyond the documented facts. Among the most persistent was the suggestion that Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and second in line to the throne, had been among the visitors to Cleveland Street. This allegation has never been substantiated. Historians who have examined the surviving evidence have found no reliable documentation linking the prince to the brothel, and the claim is generally treated as speculation rather than established fact. Yet the rumor persisted, fueled by the secrecy surrounding the investigation and the perception that the authorities had something to hide. The scandal unfolded against a backdrop of competing events that divided public attention. The reign of Queen Victoria continued, and the business of empire, commerce, and politics proceeded alongside the courtroom dramas of Cleveland Street. The premiership of Lord Salisbury provided the political context, a conservative government attentive to questions of order and respectability. The scandal posed a challenge to that order, threatening to expose the private lives of men whose public roles depended on an appearance of moral rectitude. The response of the authorities was cautious, and to many observers inadequate. The decision not to prosecute certain high-status suspects was defended on legal grounds, with officials citing the difficulty of securing convictions and the risks of public trials that might prove inconclusive. Critics saw in these explanations a willingness to sacrifice justice to expediency, protecting the reputation of the aristocracy at the expense of the rule of. The trials that did take place offered a partial reckoning. Newlove and Veck were convicted and sentenced, their punishment serving as a public demonstration that the law would be enforced, at least against those without the means to resist it. The libel trial of Ernest Park added another layer to the story, shifting attention from the brothel itself to the question of what could be said about it in print. Park's conviction and imprisonment sent a message to other journalists, a warning that the exposure of scandal carried its own dangers. The scandal revealed something about the character of late Victorian society, its anxieties, its contradictions, and its limits. The law that criminalized homosexual acts was enforced with uneven vigor, falling most heavily on those least able to defend themselves. The press, for all its energy, operated within constraints that protected the powerful from full exposure. The investigation that began with a search of a telegraph boy's pockets ended with questions that remained unanswered, names that were never confirmed, and a sense that the full truth of Cleveland Street had been allowed to slip away. In the years that followed, the scandal receded from immediate public attention, overtaken by other events and other controversies. Yet it left traces in the historical record, in the court proceedings and newspaper articles, in the legal opinions and police reports that documented what had occurred. Those traces have been revisited by later generations, each finding in the story reflections of their own concerns about justice, privacy, and the uses of power. The Cleveland Street scandal did not produce immediate legal reform. The laws that criminalized homosexual acts remained in force for decades, and the attitudes that sustained them persisted long after the names of the participants had faded from memory. But the scandal contributed to a slow accumulation of doubt, a questioning of whether the law as it stood served the interests of justice, or merely the interests of those who wielded it. That questioning would continue through the trials and debates of the 20th century until the legal landscape was finally transformed. For now, in the autumn of 1889, the city went on with its business. The streets around Cleveland Street remained busy with traffic and commerce. The gas lamps flickered on at dusk, and the telegraph boys continued their rounds, carrying messages through a London that had briefly glimpsed one of its hidden corners, and then, with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, looked away. Cleveland Street remains. If you were to walk there today, you would find it much as the Victorians left it in outline, though the particulars have shifted with the century and more that has passed. The street runs northward from Goodge Street, a quiet stretch in Fitzrovia, where the traffic of Tottenham Court Road fades to something gentler. The buildings are still largely Georgian and early Victorian in character, their brick faces softened by time, their windows looking out upon a London that has changed beyond recognition, and yet in certain lights seems almost unchanged. Number 19 no longer stands as it did. The structure has been altered, absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of a working street. There is no plaque to mark what happened there, no memorial stone set into the pavement. The address exists in historical mapping projects and in the careful notes of those who study the hidden corners of the city, but to the passing pedestrian, it is simply another doorway, another set of windows reflecting the grey London sky. The rear entrance, once used by visitors seeking discretion in the hours between dusk and midnight, has long since been reconfigured or closed. The gas lamps that once flickered along the street have given way to electric light, and the clatter of horse-drawn traffic has been replaced by the hum of cars and the occasional bicycle. If you were to stand on Cleveland Street on a summer evening, you might notice how the light falls across the brick, how the shadows gather in the doorways as the sun sets. You might hear the distant rumble of the underground, or the laughter of people leaving the cafes and restaurants that now occupy the ground floors of these old buildings. The street is busy with ordinary life, with workers heading home and visitors wandering through Fitzrovia in search of a meal or a quiet drink. There is nothing to suggest that this was once a place of scandal, of secret comings and goings, of young men earning a few extra shillings in rooms behind closed doors. The General Post Office, too, has changed. The great building that once stood at St. Martin's le Grand, where telegraph boys collected their messages and set out on their rounds, was demolished in the 20th century. The site is now occupied by newer structures, and the institution itself has been reorganized and renamed. The telegraph, that marvel of Victorian communication, has faded into history, replaced by technologies that would have seemed miraculous to the clerks and messengers of 1889. But the records remain. In the archives of the National Archives and in the digitized pages of the Old Bailey Sessions papers, the names of Charles Swinskow, Henry Newlove, Charles Hammond, and the others survive, preserved in the careful handwriting of clerks and the typeset columns of court reports. The Old Bailey itself still stands, though the building that heard the trials of the Cleveland Street defendants has been replaced by the present structure, completed in 1907. The Central Criminal Court continues to hear cases, its dome visible from the streets around Newgate. Inside, the wood-panelled courtrooms echo with the voices of barristers and judges, much as they did in the late 19th century. The law has changed in ways that the Victorians could scarcely have imagined. The offences for which Newlove and Veck were imprisoned, the acts that sent Lord Arthur Somerset into exile and brought Ernest Park to trial for libel, are no longer crime. The legislation that once made intimacy between men a matter for the courts has been repealed, and the lives that were shadowed by fear of prosecution are now, in principle, protected by law. The archival record of the Cleveland Street scandal is fragmentary but substantial. Police reports, witness statements, and court transcripts survive in official collections, though some documents have been lost or destroyed over the intervening years. The full text of Inspector Abeline's interview with Lord Arthur Somerset, conducted on 7 August 1889, has not survived. Other records are incomplete, their pages missing or damaged. What remains is enough to reconstruct the broad outlines of the case, to trace the movements of the investigators and the accused, to read the words spoken in courtrooms and printed in newspapers. But there are gaps, silences where the voices of the past have been lost. The names of the telegraph boys appear in these records, but their later lives are largely unrecorded. Charles Swinskow, who was about 15 years old when he was first questioned by Constable Hanks at the General Post Office, disappears from the historical record after the scandal fades from the newspapers. We do not know what became of him, whether he remained in London or moved elsewhere, whether he found steady work or struggled in the years that followed. The same is true of the other boys who were drawn into the affair. They were working-class youths, employed in low-paid positions, and their stories were not considered worthy of preservation by the institutions of their time. They appear in the archives as witnesses, as names on lists, as figures in a scandal that briefly illuminated their existence and then moved on. What the records do preserve is a sense of the pressures that shaped their choices. A telegraph boy at the General Post Office earned about 11 shillings a week, a sum that was barely sufficient to cover the costs of lodging and food in late Victorian London. The money offered at 19 Cleveland Street, a few shillings for a visit, represented a significant supplement to those meagre wages. The boys who accepted that money were not, in any simple sense, free agents. They were young, they were poor, and they were subject to the authority of older men who controlled access to the brothel and its clients. The law treated them as participants in criminal acts, but later historians have often described them as victims of exploitation, caught between economic necessity and the demands of a system that offered them few alternatives. The unequal treatment of the participants in the scandal has been a recurring theme in historical writing. Newlove and Veck, the procurers, received sentences of 4 months and 9 months respectively, terms that were widely seen as lenient given the maximum penalty of 2 years. Charles Hammond, the brothel keeper, fled to France before he could be arrested and was never brought to trial. Lord Arthur Somerset, whose name appeared repeatedly in police reports and witness statements, left England for the continent and spent the rest of his life in exile, beyond the reach of English courts. The allegations against Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, have never been substantiated, and most historians treat them as rumor rather than established fact. What is clear is that the full weight of the law fell most heavily upon those who could least afford to bear it, while those with wealth and connections found ways to escape. The scandal contributed to a slow accumulation of doubt about the justice system and the society it served. In the years that followed, questions about the criminalization of homosexuality, the treatment of working-class youths, and the privileges of the aristocracy would continue to be debated, sometimes quietly, sometimes in the glare of public attention. The legal reforms that eventually decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adults in England and Wales did not come until 1967, nearly 80 years after the events at Cleveland Street. The path from scandal to reform was long and uneven, marked by further prosecutions, further injustices, and the gradual shifting of public opinion. Today, the memory of the Cleveland Street scandal persists in scholarly work, in local histories, and in the digital archives that make the records of the past accessible to new generations. There are no formal memorials, no plaques or statues to mark what happened. The street itself is the only monument, its bricks and windows bearing silent witness to a chapter of London's history that was once spoken of only in whispers. Let us return, for a moment, to the young men who walked these streets in the summer of 1889. They were telegraph boys, messengers carrying words across a city that was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. They moved through crowds and traffic, past gas lamps and shop fronts, delivering news of births and deaths, of business deals and family quarrels. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, by the demands of employers and the constraints of poverty, by laws that criminalized their desires and a society that offered them little protection. They were not the authors of the scandal that bears the name of Cleveland Street. They were in many ways its least powerful participants, and yet it is their names that survive in the archives, their words that echo in the court records. We do not know what dreams they carried with them, what hopes they held for the future. The records tell us only what they did, not what they felt, but we can say this: They were young, they were alive, and they moved through a London that was, for all its darkness, full of possibility. The city that surrounded them, with its crowded streets and flickering lights, was a place of both danger and wonder. They were part of it for a time, and then they were gone, their stories folded into the vast archive of the past. The evening settles over Cleveland Street. The last light fades from the upper windows, and the lamps come on along the pavement. The city grows quiet, or as quiet as London ever grows, and the sounds of traffic and conversation soften into a gentle. The buildings stand as they have stood for more than a century, their faces turned toward the street, their doors closed against the night. Somewhere in the archives, the records wait, patient and still, holding the names of those who passed this way. Enclosing the street is quiet now. The brick facades of Cleveland Street catch the last of the evening light, and the windows darken one by one as the city settles into stillness. Somewhere below, the hum of London continues, but here, in this small corner of Fitzrovia, the night is gentle. To remember is to honor those whose names have faded from the record, and to acknowledge the silences that remain. Thank you for listening. Whenever you wish to return, you will find us here. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.